G'day, this is Professor Randy Gallant, and welcome to a real-life UDL case study. The purpose of this case study is to examine the past educational experiences of a student with physical disability and suggest strategies to help eliminate barriers for future students utilizing the principles of UDL. So what is UDL? UDL stands for Universal Design for Learning. Basically, it's an educational framework that is based on research. And the idea is that it guides the development of flexible learning environments and learning spaces that can accommodate individual learning differences. It's based on three principles: multiple means of representation, so give learners various ways to acquire information and knowledge; multiple means of expression, to provide learners with alternatives for demonstrating what they know; multiple means of engagement, to tap into learners' interests, challenge them appropriately, and motivate them to learn. So the subject for this case study, this particular subject identifies as male. He goes by the name of Kevin. He is currently 48 years old. Kevin grew up in Toronto, Ontario. He has moderate cerebral palsy that affects his mobility and fine motor skills. He also has a skeletal disorder called spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia that causes pain and lack of movement in his joints, a short stature, and spinal deformities. Kevin currently uses a power wheelchair as his mobility aid and describes himself as an active learner who enjoys working with others. Kevin does not like to be singled out for his disability. The scope of this study. The information gathered for this case study was obtained from a telephone interview on March 10th of 2022. The interview was recorded and lasted for approximately 1 hour. This study follows Kevin's experiences from elementary school to secondary school and then off to university from the years 1980 to 1998. So please keep in mind as we go through this case study that computer technology was not available in the classroom until Kevin reached post-secondary. So let's take a look at Kevin's elementary school story. So Kevin went to elementary school from grade 1 to 8. His school was located in the Toronto District School Board. It was Sunnyview Junior and Senior Public School. It's a fully self-contained, congregated special education school serving students with complex physical, developmental, and/or medical health needs. They provide a safe, nurturing, and welcoming environment with a wide range of educational and social opportunities for students. So in elementary school, Kevin used a manual wheelchair for his mobility. He traveled to and from school on a special wheelchair accessible bus. Because of his cerebral palsy causing fine motor skills, Kevin could not write clearly or with enough pace to keep up with the class. Computers were not available in school during this time. So Kevin and a number of his classmates used typewriters to complete their schoolwork, which includes solving math problems and calculations on a typewriter. So showing your work. Kevin required a special guard over the keys that would only allow him to hit one key at a time. So basically the guard sat over top of the keys of the keyboard with small holes over each key. Kevin types with one finger, so he could rest his hand on the keyboard. It would not press any of the keys, and his single finger could then poke through the hole and hit the key that he wants. At the time, teachers were using paper and chalkboard, and the students were reading from hard copy books. Everyone in the class had a form of physical disability and were presented the same material in the same way. Because of the type of school that Sunnyview is, All physical barriers were removed school-wide, and that was part of the design model. From Kevin's recollections, there was actually no formal UDL principles utilized in elementary school classes, but there were different accommodations made for different students depending on what their abilities were. So some students used typewriters, where others were able to write with a pen or pencil. Some students received more time to complete assignments and tests. So imagine if you're doing a test on a typewriter where you can only type with one finger, it takes you longer to perform that task. During structured phys ed, all students participated together, but to different levels based on their ability. And there was also educational assistants or teacher assistants in the class to help with any physical needs that the students had. What Kevin remembers from his experience at Sunnyview School. He remembers that there was a meeting called at the end of grade 6, and Kevin's family was informed that the teacher believes that he could, in the next year, transfer to an integrated school and be successful. Kevin decided that he was going to wait till grade 8 before transferring because he was very comfortable at Sunnyview and enjoyed competing in sports against others with disabilities. And you'll see how this shows up again throughout his educational experiences. He knew that at the time, if he was to transfer to an integrated school, he would not be able to participate in sports anymore. Kevin also states that he was worried about being seen as different and standing out in an integrated program. Let's take a look at some of the UDL principles that could be used or adopted today at Sunnyview School to help somebody like Kevin. There are many options to support students using UDL principles, and a lot of them came about because of computer technology and the availability of it in the classroom. So, easy example, options for learning material can now be provided, making it easier for Kevin with his limited motor skills. So, back in Kevin's day, there was only hard copy books. Now you can have a hard copy book, you can have a PDF, you can have e-readers, etc., etc., etc. You can have software that will read the book to you. Many different options available. Technology provides new ways to access student knowledge, therefore replacing Kevin's typewriter. So now we have computers that have software that allow you to type. There is speech to text. There's audio recordings. There are special features in software that allow easier access to completing, so spell check, grammar checks, things like that that weren't available back in those days. Even things like correcting your error. On a typewriter, correcting an error is very difficult, whereas using a computer, you hit that backspace key. There's also many visual multimedia techniques that are now available. So you've got video and presentation software, and that could be used to engage his active experience. Kevin could easily provide different options for subject matter due to the availability of internet resources. So back in Kevin's day, there was textbooks. The textbooks had to be in the classroom ahead of time. So they had to be in the inventory of what that teacher had available. Nowadays, with all kinds of access to material through the internet, much easier to be able to change the subject matter to better suit students. So let's move on and take a look at Kevin's secondary school story. Kevin went to school at Pope John Paul II Secondary High School in Toronto, Ontario. He was transported to and from school in an accessible bus. Kevin was the only student with a physical disability in the regular stream at that school. At this time, Kevin acquired a powered wheelchair. He attended this school from grade 9 to 13. The school was actually fairly new, and it was built and designed to be very accessible. A resource room was provided for Kevin, which had a typewriter, and this is where Kevin could go and work by himself to do tests and assignments and things like that where he needed extra time. In his classes, Kevin had a very hard time taking notes. Again, he couldn't hold a pen, he couldn't write legibly, and it was very, very slow. So basically, they came up with this ingenious idea. Kevin's father at the time was a printer and had lots of access to carbon paper. So what they did is Kevin had an arrangement with one of the students in the class where the student would take notes on a piece of paper with a carbon copy paper underneath, therefore making a carbon copy of the student's notes for Kevin. For his phys ed class, Kevin could not compete against the able-bodied students, so they gave him a choice of what he wanted to do. And he always chose to work on his wheelchair hockey skills. And again, this is going to come up future in this presentation, but Kevin was very involved in power wheelchair hockey. From Kevin's recollection, classroom material was not presented in any kind of multiple formats. Everybody got the same information at the same time. Kevin had the same learning outcomes as everyone else in the class, but with accommodation for extra time and access to the resource room. Other than his choices for phys ed, there were no options of what material was covered nor how it was assessed. Because it was secondary school, Kevin was able to select some classes that interested him and ones that he could participate fully. So Kevin did not take art, he did not take music, and he did not take shop classes. I asked Kevin at this point in the interview if he had felt included, integrated, segregated, or excluded. And this is what he had to say. He said, in elementary school, he felt included. But at secondary school, he felt integrated. He said there was a big difference between the elementary school environment and the secondary school environment. In secondary school, he was the only one with a physical disability in that school, so he didn't have a lot of close friends. And he always had the feeling that he was different. I asked Kevin what he remembers most about his high school experience. And he said it was his first real integrated experience, and he said that at the time he really needed it. It prepared him for future experiences and encouraged him to come out of his shell. So Kevin had to work at making friends. Kevin suggested that if there was an option today, he would have rather had a segregated phys ed class where he could participate fully with his peers with physical disabilities and not in the general school population. But back when Kevin was in high school, remember, he was the only student in that school with a physical disability. What he would suggest is if there were more students in that school, that he would take his phys ed classes with those students so that they could compete on a level playing field. So fair and equal sports competition is very important to Kevin. So Kevin loved to play wheelchair hockey. So Kevin's love for hockey led him to play and eventually coach for Canada's national power hockey team. So Kevin has traveled throughout North America and the world playing and coaching in power wheelchair hockey. So what are some UDL principles that could be adopted today at Pope John Paul II Secondary School? Again, remember that today the availability of technology really increases the options for UDL, especially at secondary. Online education options for Kevin would give him choices on learning environments. Giving Kevin options for assessment types, so things like tests versus projects versus assignments. When I asked Kevin about this, he said he would choose projects or assignments over tests, and he would prefer an oral exam over a written one. Many technology options now exist for presenting material visually to engage his active learning style. Group work options. So there's the option of group work, but now we have virtual or in person. When I asked Kevin, he said he would prefer in-person group work because he enjoys the contact with others. Kevin enjoys active learning, so things like case study or role play options would benefit somebody like him. As well, student-chosen electives to personalize the educational experience. So in secondary school, students have the option to pick some of their classes. If you remember from the previous slide, things like art and shop classes, music classes were not options for Kevin. So giving some more options for things that somebody with a physical disability can do to personalize that educational experience would be an advantage. Student-chosen activities as well. So Kevin states that he would like the option to participate in school activities, but with others with physical disabilities. So again, things like phys ed, if they were designed or a program was designed to be able to include a class of folks with physical disabilities being able to participate fully together as a group, Kevin said that would be a benefit to him. So now let's take a look at Kevin's post-secondary story. Kevin attended RYERSON Polytechnic University in Toronto, Ontario. He graduated in 1998 with a degree in business management and a major in human resources. Everyone was in the same classes, learning the same material in the same way. RYERSON had a very large center for students with disabilities, and students received personal accommodation as needed. Some of Kevin's accommodations were as follows. He had access to computers now, and that was in the Center for Students with Disabilities. He had extra time on tests and assignments. Again, he had the peer note taker using the carbon paper. And he had a paid student assistant to accurately input his data into accounting software. Because of Kevin's mobility issues and the problem he has with fine motor skills, he was finding it very difficult to accurately input data into software. So the university actually hired a student to be Kevin's assistant and input Kevin's data into the software for him. Some basic UDL principles that Kevin experienced at post-secondary at Ryerson. There were many options for elective courses based on student preferences. Students were able to select topics for their class projects. So again, making it more engaging to them. Teachers were starting to use multimedia visuals in their teaching, so PowerPoints and videos were starting to become a thing at post-secondary. So basically, 1997-ish, we've got PowerPoint being launched by Microsoft. So let's take a look at some of the UDL principles that could be adopted today at Ryerson Polytechnic University to help somebody like Kevin. If given a choice of assessment techniques, Kevin says he would prefer to have assignments or projects over an exam. If he had to do an exam, he would much prefer an oral type exam over a written one. Because of Kevin's lack of motor skills, he can't write with a pen or pencil, and it takes him a long time to type out answers with one finger. Kevin said that he learned a lot better when he was more actively engaged, so he enjoyed classes where there was role playing. So any particular class, group work, anything where he was part of the learning experience. He also stated he was more engaged during group work and any type of active learning. If available, Kevin said he would have been open to options of distance education for at least some of his classes. Having class notes provided ahead of time by the teacher would cut down on Kevin relying on the carbon paper copy of his classmates' notes. Having access to audio or video recorded lectures would all but eradicate the need for that carbon paper copy. So my final thoughts. Modern technology has really played a large part in UDL implementation. You can see that throughout the history of Kevin's experience. So back when Kevin was starting elementary school and through his high school, he did not have access to computers. But once computers became available to him in post-secondary, it opened up a lot of options for how he was getting his material, how he was assessed. So a lot of UDL implementation came about because of technology. So the availability of internet and computers, especially in the classrooms, has opened up many new options for teachers. Kevin said that he wishes teachers were more aware of UDL principles and utilize them in today's classrooms. Currently, Kevin is employed full-time. He has been for over 20 years at a government agency, and he's putting his education to work. A student like Kevin was able to make it all the way through the education system and become very successful without the benefits of UDL. So imagine what can be done for all kinds of students if we were to incorporate more DL into the design of our classrooms. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Kevin for his time, for helping me create this case study based on his personal educational experience. This has been Professor Randy Gallant. Thank you for watching.